Hi, I'm Dr. Bobby Du Bois, and welcome to Live Long and Well, a podcast where we will talk about what you can do to live as long as possible and with as much energy and vigor that you wish. Together, we will explore what practical and evidence-supported steps you can take. Come join me on this very important journey, and I hope that you feel empowered along the way. I'm a physician, Ironman triathlete, and have published several hundred scientific studies. I'm honored to be your guide. Hello, health seekers, and welcome to episode 19. Seed oils, true harm, or just another food fear fad? Well, I hope I will provide evidence that you can answer this question for yourself by the time we're done. Well, many headlines and social media posts and all trying to frighten us that seed oils like canola oil or safflower oil cause inflammation, they cause heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. Now, is that true? What do we know? Our goal today is to find evidence to answer this question, one way or the other. Well, as always, I like to share with you, well, how did I get interested in this topic and why now? Well, my dear wife, Gail, asked me as I was preparing dinner, and I was going to make fried chicken in our deep fat fryer. She asked if I was going to use a seed oil. And if I was, because I was going to use canola oil, she would pass on the chicken. So I thought, what do we really know about seed oils? Should we fear what some call the hateful eight or not? Well, down the rabbit hole I went. First, I had to find whatever evidence was available. And step two, I spoke to some experts. I spoke to people who were food chemists, one of which actually worked to develop oils that would be sold, and also worked in a coffee manufacturing environment. Spoke with dietitians and tried to understand where they're coming from and what they thought about this. And what I did is I said, okay, experts, here's what I found. Am I on the right track or not? As folks know, I am not a nutritionist. I'm not a dietitian. I'm a physician, not with expertise in these areas, but expertise in looking at evidence. I also love to cook, and I am the chef for our bed and breakfast guests if they want it. So I'm motivated to help my family to eat the right food. And obviously, I want to do the right thing. I guess the good news is I don't have a pony in this race. I'm okay whether the evidence takes us towards seed oils are problematic or whether they're not. And I hope because I don't have that pony in the race, I can be fair and balanced and review the evidence and share what I found. Now, I do hope you'll listen to the whole episode. There's lots of good stuff in it. But if you want to just get the take-home messages, I'll provide them for you, and there are 4 of them. After looking at all the evidence, talking to people, thinking about this a lot, number 1, I don't fear seed oils. To me, they are not the hateful eight. 2, I have made some changes, but they're small in how I use oils, and I'll explain what they are. 3rd, we need to think about the prices that are higher worth it. And the prices are a lot higher if you use olive oil or avocado oil all the time. And 4, likely, probably very likely, the oils themselves, these seed oils, are not the problem. The problem is that these seed oils are inexpensive to make, and that gave birth to an industry of food folks making chips and cookies and packaged foods that are high calorie dense items and highly processed foods. So I think it's not the seed oils, it's what having inexpensive oils led to. Let's dive in. And I'd like to begin with a historical perspective. Nutrition concerns have been around for decades. And as we find, the claims are often wrong. And so I tend to be skeptical about food claims and provide a wait and see attitude. Let me see what the evidence is as it collects over time and not rush to what people are saying. Well, 4 examples of this historical perspective. First, some years ago, eggs and shrimp were bad because people said, well, they have a lot of cholesterol. And if you eat cholesterol, that's got to be bad for you because high cholesterol isn't good. Well, it turned out that your body makes all of the cholesterol that we see, and that eating cholesterol foods like eggs or shrimp makes no difference. So lots of fear. Then all of a sudden people said, don't worry. For a period of time, coffee was bad. Well, it turned out probably it wasn't the coffee. It was the cigarette alongside the coffee, or maybe the cream in your coffee. And if you're interested, I have a full podcast on coffee, and that's episode 8. Well, there was also the fear of peanuts for young kiddos. And they said, well, because of the fear of peanut allergies, there should be no peanuts eaten in the first 3 years of life. Well, that turned out to be a complete failure. We ended up with more peanut allergies because we weren't exposing the kiddos early on to peanuts. So that got reversed. And of course, over the years, there's been the butter is bad. We must use margarine instead of butter. Well, the margarine had trans fats. That wasn't good. Now trans fats have been removed. And probably switching away from these fats really didn't help us any. In fact, it probably made us worse because people ended up eating more carbs, more sugar, since they were lowering the amount of fat in their diet. So lots of reasons to maintain a healthy skepticism. So my approach, I wait for evidence, and not just any evidence, but evidence in people before I'm beginning to accept some new food fad as truth. Well, let me explain what seed oils are, because some of you may not have been following this that carefully. The Hateful Eight, or a series of the following seed oils, meaning oils that come from seeds: corn, canola, safflower, cottonseed, grapeseed, rice bran, soybean, and sunflower. Now, these are really low cost to produce, especially corn oil and canola oil. And when there was a fear of too much saturated fats in our diet, people shifted to these then inexpensive seed oils. But what do we know? Well, as folks know, I really, really like to find a randomized trial that answers the ultimate question. There is none. So there is no study that says, okay, you, this group, are going to eat seed oils, and you, this other group, are going to have other plant-based oils like avocado or olive or coconut, and see who does better. Well, there is that. There is no study like that. So what the fear fad is about is a lot of what I call mechanistic or biochemical evidence. And this comes up periodically in our episode discussions. And what does that mechanistic argument look like? Well, it looks like, seed oil has a particular thing in it that's bad. Well, that is PUFAs, and we'll talk about PUFAs later, or aromatic hydrocarbons. So seed oils have these things that are potentially bad. And if we feed mice these compounds, it leads to mice inflammation. Well, we think inflammation in general is bad, chronic inflammation, and therefore, the mechanistic folks say, avoid seed oils. But again, there isn't that randomized trial that walks us through carefully how this might affect humans. So in the absence of that definitive trial, I scratched my head and thought long and hard to say, how can we fairly and carefully sort through this? So I came up with a series of key questions that might help us sort through all of this and come up with some what I think are pretty good answers. So there's basically 7 key questions and 1 bonus question that we're going to talk about. Okay, and as I walk through this, we're in October of 2024. I'm always open for new evidence. And if you, my listeners, wish to send me some things, I would love to learn as much as I can. And maybe there'll be some new information over the next 6 months. And I'm always happy to update my beliefs because, again, I don't really have an argument one way or the other. And as always, studies that I talk about here, I will link in the show notes. Okay, so the first of the 7 questions are corn, like a corn on the cob, peanuts in a shell, and the vegetables that turn into seed oils, are they inherently bad? So eating peanuts, bad. Eating corn, bad. I don't think there's any data to support that. I think corn and peanuts are wonderful foods, obviously in a balanced way and not eating too many calories. You know, and the Mediterranean diet certainly has a lot of this. So I think if you're worried about seed oils, it isn't the vegetable per se. All right, that's question number 1. I think from my standpoint, I feel like comfortable with the answer that that's not the problem. All right, so maybe the problem isn't the vegetables themselves, but it's getting the oil out of the vegetables. Now, getting the oil out of the vegetables could have 2 problems. One is in getting the oils out, you use bad stuff or chemicals to do that. That could be a problem. Or when you make the oils, you're actually getting rid of good stuff. So in the corn itself, good stuff, take the corn oil out, maybe some of that good stuff goes by the wayside. So maybe that's what's going on. Well, let me explain briefly, and I certainly had no knowledge of how you make oils. Well, let me tell you how it's done. So there's basically 2 steps. Step 1 is you extract the oil. And some people might think, oh, well, you're just taking the corn and you're squeezing it in a press and out comes the oils. But that's not how it's done. Basically, it's done by heating that corn or whatever it is, that's the seed oil, and adding a certain chemical to help get the oil out. And traditionally, it's been hexane, which is a gas. Now, hexane, if it were to remain in the oil, is a problem. But the hexane is essentially all gone. So yes, it's used in the extraction process, but it's really not in the final product you're going to eat. Now, you could argue that the workers are exposed to a lot more hexane. They could have problems. And this is not an episode on worker safety, and I don't really know the literature on this. Okay, so now we've removed the basic oils. Step 2, now you do what's called refining and denaturing it. This helps the oils to have a better taste. And when you remove these items, you're taking some particles or sediment out of those oils. And the argument is it makes it tastier, it makes it more shelf stable, doesn't go rancid, and makes it more stable for cooking, meaning it's not going to smoke as much. So it's possible, it's not the compounds per se that are in the oil, that's when you're done, it's that perhaps you've removed some good stuff. Now, there's no evidence to that. Nobody has ever taken the good stuff, maybe, that comes out of that refined oil and see if that's healthy or not healthy. We don't know. There is an alternative way to get oils out, and that's called cold pressing, which is what it sounds like. And that's what's done for olive oil sometimes. It's a lot more costly and is not how the typical seed oils are created. Okay, so we're on to number 3. So if it's not the vegetable itself, nothing against the peanut, the poor peanut or the poor corn on the cob, and it appears not to be the processing, maybe it's just the basic chemical components of the seed oil itself. Well, all oils have some combination of saturated fats. Saturated fats are things like butter or lard. They tend to be solid at room temperature. And then monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats. Now, polyunsaturated fats are called, for short, PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the difference between a saturated fat, an unsaturated fat, and an polyunsaturated fat is really how the carbon atoms are connected. Whether it's a single bond or a double bond. If it's a single bond, they're called saturated. If there's a double bond somewhere, it's called unsaturated. Now, PUFAs, polyunsaturated, means there's a few different double bonds somewhere in the molecule. Just hearing the word PUFA sounds bad. It can't be good for you to eat PUFAs. But let's get real. What is olive oil? That's a PUFA. What's the oil that's in fatty fish? That's a PUFA. So therefore, it's not the PUFA per se that's the problem, because obviously we agree that olive oil and fatty fish are good things that we want to eat. Well, maybe it's the type of PUFA. So where is that double bond? If the first double bond is in the 3 position, it's called omega-3s, which people think are wonderful. If it's in the 6th position, they're called omega-6s. Now, one of the most common fats, or the predominant fat in seed oils, is called linoleic acid. Now, again, the word linoleic acid sounds like something concocted in a lab, but it's not. That's just the most common element in your corn, in your peanuts, and such. And it is an omega-6 type of polyunsaturated. Well, lest we go down the rabbit hole that linoleic acid is bad for us, well, you need it. Your body can't produce it on its own, and it's used to form membranes, your skin. It's really, really important. Well, the theoretical problem, people say, is that, well, in the old days, when we were caveman or, before modern day, we had lots of omega-3s and we had lots of omega-6s. So they were maybe, 1-to-1. Nowadays, maybe we have 10-to-1 ratio of the omega-6s to the omega-3s. And they've done studies. They've measured people's body fat components. Back in the late 50s, about 9% of the fat was linoleic, and now it's over twice that. Okay, that sounds interesting and maybe frightening, but is there anything to suggest that having a little more linoleic acid in our body fat is harmful? Well, there are some in vitro studies. What's an in vitro study? Done in a lab, where you take linoleic acid and you expose vascular endothelium, cells that are part of your blood vessels, in a lab, not in people, and show that, this may cause some inflammation in these cells. So the argument goes, well, these studies in a lab show that this linoleic acid can cause inflammation. And we know, so they would say, inflammation causes heart disease. Therefore, eating linoleic acid is bad. Now, that's not human evidence. That's what I call mechanistic or pathway evidence. And for me, those theories, unless they're tested in people, I don't give them much credence. Okay, so maybe it's not the 6s per se, maybe. Maybe it's that we don't get enough omega-3s. So as I've mentioned, olive oil or fatty fish, those have been shown in epidemiologic studies, observational studies, that people who eat a lot of this do well, have, good hearts and live longer. But what if I told you that if you eat salmon, let's say you eat salmon 3 times a week, then you could argue, well, look, Dr. Bobby, I'm getting plenty of omega-3s. Does it really matter that I'm eating also a bunch of omega-6s? So in addition to my fish a couple of times a week, I eat, salad oil, a lot of salad dressing, which has omega-6s. Well, we don't have any evidence to that, but I would probably guess that if you're getting plenty of omega-3s, you might even worry less about this problem. Okay, well, maybe it's not a lack of omega-3s. Maybe it's you're getting too much 6s, omega-3s in your diet, and that's harmful. Now, the good news is there's a bunch of evidence, 4 different types of evidence studies in humans that help us to say, the omega-6s are not a problem. So the first rationale people say is, well, omega-6s cause inflammation. Remember those studies that happened in the test tube? Well, in humans, there have been 15 randomized controlled trials where they took people who were eating a lot of, animal fat, saturated fat, and said, okay, we're going to lower that fat and give you polyunsaturated fats, these vegetable oils, the linoleic acid, the seed oils. Okay? None of these randomized trials that compared eating a plant, the saturated fat diet versus the unsaturated fat, none of those studies changes in any markers of inflammation. Meaning it doesn't appear in these studies that these seed oils cause problems with inflammation. And they measured things like CRP, fibrinogen, TNF. These are some things you might have heard about. Okay. So maybe there's not a good argument in humans about inflammation. Well, what about heart risk? Well, in one study of studies, they combined 30 observational studies from 13 countries, and they looked at the level of linoleic acid in your blood and asked the question, okay, so people who had more of that in their blood, and the theory people would say, well, that's going to be a problem. Turned out the people who had higher linoleic acids in their blood had lower risk of heart disease or stroke, 10 to 30% lower. So now, all of a sudden, we're beginning to think, well, maybe that blood level of the linoleic acid isn't a problem. Okay, so now let's take another study. This is called the Minnesota Coronary Survey. It was a randomized trial of over 4 years and 4,300 people. And they tested switching them from their usual diet, which had a lot of animal saturated fats, to an unsaturated fat diet, predominantly unsaturated fats that included, of course, these vegetable oils. And over the course of the 4 years, there was no difference in cardiac mortality. So my interpretation is that these linoleic acids, the seed oil, the primary component of it, if anything, might be protective and no evidence that they seem to cause heart disease. Well, people argue, well, these seed oils, wait, Dr. Bobby, they cause diabetes. Just by themselves, the oils. So in the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, it's over 100,000 people, they looked at dietary data. They asked them every 2 to 4 years, what are you eating? And they compared people who had the saturated fats in their diet versus the high seed oil linoleic acids in their diet. And the people who had the higher linoleic acid had a lower risk of diabetes. All right, so what do I take from this? The seed oils are not inherently bad. So it's not the plant itself, probably not the extraction process, and it's probably not the omega-6 versus omega-3 story that's anything to worry about. Okay? But Dr. Bobby, people might say, it's the real problem is what happens when you heat the oils. So when you heat oil, now it could be butter, it could be seed oils, it can change the chemical composition of the oil and create what are called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, or aldehydes. And this can happen, this creation of these other compounds, if you heat the oil really hot. especially when it gets to smoke. And scientists have shown that if you take these compounds produced at high temperatures, it can be mutagenic in animals. What does that mean? You give it to animals, these substances, and you look at their cells and you say, some of these cells are looking abnormal. And we think it's due to these compounds. So not the seed oil themselves, but what happens to the oils when they get heated with cooking. Again, this is in animals, not in humans. And it turns out that these compounds really don't get produced if you're heating the oil to, 212, which is the standard water boiling point. And yes, you might produce more of them if you get into the 450 degree range of the oil. But for those of you who cook or don't cook, when you make fried chicken, you're nowhere near the 450 degrees. You're probably at 325 degrees. And if you're making donuts, it may be a little bit higher, around 375 degrees. Now, let me point out something. People are saying, well, these seed oils are bad, and look what happens when you heat it to high temperatures. Well, it's not a problem of seed oils alone. If you take a lovely piece of salmon or a yummy steak and you grill it, again, the heat does the same exact thing. It produces the same compound. So we might get scared about what happens with seed oils, but the same thing's going to happen if you just take your salmon or steak or anything else which has fat in it and you put it on the grill. That grilling of meat causes carcinogens or potential carcinogens. Most of the studies were done on red meat. Some have been done in fish. And if you feed those compounds to animals in high doses, it looks like it could change the DNA. Now, there's really mixed data on whether grilling increases cancer in humans. Some data to suggest it does, some data to suggest it doesn't. So maybe the problem is we should never grill, and we should then, never have high temperature cooking of our vegetables or anything else at home. Now, you could make that argument, and people say, well, I think we should do raw food for everything. We should never cook anything. I'm not going to go down that path because, I love cooked food. Where I do get a concern is in repeated use of the same oil over and over and over again at high heat. Where does this happen? It most commonly happens in a restaurant where they have a deep fat fryer because they're not changing the oil after each time they cook. They might filter it and they'll reuse it over and over and over again. So if you do save the oil and reuse it at home, or you go to a restaurant where they're using a deep fat fryer, you might be eating something that has more and more of these compounds. So I don't think there's a real issue if you're just using the oil once, throwing it out, but it might be problematic if you reuse it. And we'll come back to this a little later with where I net out on all of this. Okay, so let's say you are convinced somehow that the oils are bad. And isn't necessarily just the cooking, but even the oils themselves. I don't believe that, but some people might. Is there enough seed oils in our daily diet that there's anything really to lose sleep over? Well, 70% of the fat in our daily diet comes from meat. It comes from eating that piece of chicken or eating that piece of fish or eating that hamburger. It has nothing to do with the oils that we add. So there really may not be enough seed oil in our daily diet to worry about. Well, as a chef, let me give you some ideas about if you're sautéing vegetables. Each serving might just have a teaspoon, maybe a teaspoon and a half of oil. Salad dressing might have a couple of tablespoons in it. And fried chicken, which people say, oh, that's got to be horrible, may only have a tablespoon or so of fat. So the worry about cooking with seed oils or using it in your salad dressings seems overblown to me because you're frankly not getting that much in your daily diet. And as we've talked about, there's not a lot of evidence to make us worry one way or the other. Okay, here is where I think this question is the real question and the real answer. Number 6, are we blaming the wrong food? You know, we were maligning the poor ear of corn or the peanuts or the olives or anything else. Maybe that's not the issue. The issue isn't the oils. It's that perhaps the oils are so cheap and became so cheap because we learned how to make them so cheaply that they became a mainstay in processed foods. So when you have inexpensive oils, you can then create chips and cookies and packaged foods that is the problem. The problem is that these packaged foods allow us to gain weight, have a lot of sugar in them, and they're just about irresistible. So whereas people are getting all concerned about the seed oil, it isn't really the seed oil. It's the seed oils led to a whole industry of packaged processed, highly processed foods. And that's the problem, not the oils themselves. And I believe this is really the most compelling thing that would explain why people have some concerns. Okay, let's say you want to switch from a seed oil to something else. So I went to the market to see what is that going to cost us. Canola oil is really cheap. It's probably per ounce, which has several tablespoons in an ounce, is probably about 10 or 12 cents per ounce. Okay, if you want to use avocado oil or olive oil, that's probably 5 times the price. Sesame oil, 10 times the price. So you can do the math and see how much it might cost you a year to switch from seed oils to something else. Here's a bonus question. It's not one of the 7. Let's say you had a choice. You're going to use a fancier oil, the avocado oil or olive oil, instead of seed oils. And you're going to, because that's more expensive, you'll save money and just buy regular vegetables. Would that be safer, healthier, than spending less money on the oil, but getting organic, pesticide-free vegetables? Now, it may not be a fair comparison because the organic vegetables may cost more over the course of the year than using, the fancy oils, but it's an interesting question to ponder. All right, what do we do with this information? If you still feel, despite the evidence I've shared, that seed oils make you feel bad, you think it makes you have inflamed or swollen joints or brain fog or headaches, this could be a perfect time for an N-of-1 trial. You could go through a period of time eating your current diet, write down how you're feeling, try going for perhaps a month, switching out seed oils to something else, measure again, and see what you think. Okay. So let's sum up now. Where do I net out? What am I thinking about the evidence and the arguments and the 7 questions I raised? Well, at this point, I'm not worrying about seed oils. Frankly, I'm not using a lot of them, and I'm not going to worry. I do believe the key issue is that the seed oils led to all of these calorie-dense, yummy, ultra-processed foods, and that's the issue. I do use olive oil or avocado oil for salad dressing or for general cooking at not particularly high temperatures. And if you want to do that, that would be good too. No reason not to. I love butter and I use it a lot when I'm cooking. And if it's going to be a high temperature cooking, I use clarified butter or ghee because it tends not to smoke, has a higher smoking point. In my deep fat fryer, I am going to switch out my canola oil to something different. probably peanut oil. I may try using clarified butter. That's really expensive for a deep fat fryer, but I may play around. People say the food tastes amazing when you use clarified butter, so I may see. Where I do have a concern is the restaurant use and reuse in their deep fat fryers. Because if the high heat is producing some of these aromatic hydrocarbons and aldehydes, them using it over and over and over again could be problematic. Am I never going to have French fries or fried chicken again in a restaurant? No, but I'll be mindful of it. I net out also if an N of 1 trial is something that makes sense to you, then by all means do it. Let me step back for a moment and explain why these food fads take hold. Even though there isn't evidence in humans that I find compelling, people tout these arguments, these theoretical reasons, these mechanistic stories. And I think it catches hold in many people because if somebody says to you, a supposed expert, don't eat seed oils, they are the hateful eight, they are bad for you, and by taking them out of your diet, you're doing something good for your health, well, people might do it, not because there may be evidence to support it, but we all like to feel we are taking charge of our health. And if it's something as simple as swapping out your oils and you feel like you're doing a good thing, people do it. I tend to be more of a scientist and I want evidence, so I'm not going to do it because it just makes me feel good. In another episode, we're going to talk about placebos and what are called nocebos, because I think this is a particularly strong issue. And I think that's part of the agency of wanting to do something. Well, we're just about done. And on our journey to live long and well, I don't think, given what I found, what I've known, what I've talked to people, that seed oils are a major roadblock on that journey. So let me return to the title. Seed oils, true harm or just another food fear fad? Based upon what we know today, that fear is not worth acting on. Until next time. Thanks so much for listening to Live Long and Well with Dr. Bobby. If you like this episode, please provide a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you listen. If you want to continue this journey or want to receive my newsletter on practical and scientific ways to improve your health and longevity, please visit me at drbobbylivellongandwell.com. That's doctor as in DR, Bobby, livelongandwell.com.